Let's start this video by looking at some of the key trends now in foreign direct investment. And certainly if we look over the last 30 or so years, the flows of FDI across the globe have certainly increased. In spite of the declining trade barriers, FDI has grown much more rapidly than world trade in general and output due to a number of reasons. And firstly, there is this issue that we spoke about previously in previous weeks. The businesses have fearing increasing protectionist pressures we spoke about I think it was last week's videos when we discussed the world trade system, how as in the last few decades there has been increasing concerns over the level of protectionist policies that are being applied around the world, which obviously flies in the face of this push towards free trade. So foreign direct investment is a way of circumventing a lot of those things like tariffs and subsidies which are implemented by governments. The liberalisation of the world economy has made it easier for firms to engage in foreign direct investment as more and more countries have opened up their economies around the world. And we're also seeing more than ever global strategies being adopted by firms. It's actually quite rare today to find a company which limits its operations to a single country. Most of them, especially as they continue to grow, start to look to implement global standardized strategies that can be applied across their global operations. In terms of some of the directions that we've been able to identify in terms of foreign direct investment, from a traditional sense, most of the FDI was directed at developed nations, and it was between developed nations as well, and that became known as North-North foreign direct investment. So it was largely just in between, occurring amongst those highly developed nations. And for that reason, the US has for a long time been a favourite target for foreign direct investment inflows, and there are a number of key reasons why this is the case. Certainly on a comparative scale, they have a large and wealthy population. They are throwing dollar bills away all the time, or at least Jordan Belfort was, that is for sure. They have a dynamic economy, unlike others around the world, which often stagnate. Typically, as I say, at least on a relative scale, the US economy is usually quite dynamic and ever-changing and forward and quite progressive. They have a stable political environment. When we talk about stability here, we're not talking about mental stability. We're talking about the stability in terms of the continuing political system that we see in place. You know, you're not concerned about revolutions or military coups occurring in the United States. There might be changes in respective governments, but you generally know how the system is going to play out. The US is also particularly open and encouraging of foreign direct investment, Christina Aguilera style. You know, they're all about welcoming foreign direct investment into their economy. They recognize the value that investment into the US can actually bring to its economy. What we have tended to see, though, at the same time, especially over recent years, was that there's been an increasing trend in terms of the FDI into developing nations. Now, this is both in terms of North-South FDI, which is foreign direct investment from developed nations into the developing nations, as well as also South-South FDI, as it's known, which is from developing nation into another developing nation. And this has especially been the case in some of these key emerging economies around Asia that we've spoken about in previous weeks, and especially more recently into China as well. It's also important to understand the different forms that foreign direct investment may take, and there are a couple of main ones that we're going to focus on here. The first is called greenfield investment, which unfortunately has nothing to do with that delicious fruit juice and certainly nothing to do with that music festival in Switzerland. Have a look at that lineup. Nothing to do with that within the context of international business, though, unfortunately. This here is when there is foreign direct investment in a completely new facility. So you're starting from scratch, you're not purchasing somebody else, any existing operations. You are building your operations in that foreign market from scratch. As a consequence, it's most common in developing nations because there isn't that already existing infrastructure and operations that you might otherwise look to be purchasing that has already been set up for you. It's best for transferring specialised, hard-to-imitate resources for that reason. When you want the greatest degree of control over your foreign operations, greenfield investment tends to be the option of choice here. It gives you that, because obviously everything is started from scratch, you get to tailor everything as to how you would like to run your foreign operations exactly how you would like it, rather than having to modify a business that somebody else had already set up previous to your ownership. So it gives you those greater control relative to exporting or licensing, certainly, and also fewer coordination problems compared to mergers and acquisitions. You're not having to incorporate an existing workforce. You're literally, in most cases at least, either sending some expatriates from your home market over to that target market, or hiring a brand new workforce. And obviously that means you get to select those workers that you want, rather than having to rehire those from an existing company. The other key form of foreign direct investment, and we'll count it as a single form, although these two are slightly different, are known as mergers and acquisitions. And this is obviously where you either merge with an existing foreign firm or buy out completely, or to some extent, an existing foreign firm. These tend to be more prevalent in developed nations because there already are strong competitors, or at least potentially even not so strong competitors. But the key point here is that there are existing firms that might be potential targets that you might either like to merge with or acquire or buy out altogether. They tend to be much quicker to execute than greenfield investments. You're not starting from scratch. You're not having to build everything and establish everything yourself. It's already there. You either just have to merge with it or buy it out. And as a consequence, it's usually, not always, but usually easier and perhaps less risky for a firm to acquire desired assets that already exist than build them from the ground up. Now, firms often believe that they can therefore increase the efficiency of an acquired unit by transferring their own capital, technology and management skills into that acquired unit, and that will be what will improve their performance. It doesn't always pan out like that, but we do see a lot of examples where firms look to identify underperforming foreign firms that they think, right, well, if we bring in our expertise and improve the way that company can be run, we can see potential to make money there, and to also deliver things like synergies and also develop complementary capabilities and core competencies. We've got a few examples, or at least a couple of examples of mergers and acquisitions here. The one interesting one that occurred a few years ago was between the company that built this and the company that built that. The car on the left is a Fiat. They are an Italian firm, and the car on the right is a Dodge Viper, and they are an American company. They actually merged a few years ago to form Fiat Chrysler, who own Dodge and a range of other American brands, Fiat Chrysler Automobiles. They've had their issues because, as we talked about on the previous slide, they're two existing firms from very different backgrounds, and they have different management ideologies because they have very different cultures, the Italians and the Americans, and different ideas about how best to run a car company. So they've been able to achieve some positive outcomes, but also run into a few difficulties. Another different example here, looking at an acquisition, is with our friends at David Jones. We see some of the brand ambassadors there at the races a few years ago. They were actually recently bought out by Woolworths. And we're not talking about the Australian supermarket chain here. We're talking about a South African department store mogul, a massive company based in South Africa that has recently bought out David Jones as an acquisition, and hopefully will be a little bit more successful and will be a little bit less bumpy down their road towards as they look to progress than Fiat Chrysler Automobiles have been.